it going, internet? So today we're going to be going over a tutorial on how to create realistic embers inside of After Effects using a plugin called Trapcode Particular. It's okay if you don't have it because I put a link in the description for the free trial so that you can follow along at your own pace. But in the meantime, watch this tutorial and let me know what you think. It might be good. Here we go. Okay, so here we are with a blank After Effects canvas here, and first things first, I'm going to create a new composition, set it to 1080p, and then I'm going to create a new solid. And from here, we're going to add our particle system, and that particle system is called Particular. It's from a wonderful company called Red Giant, from their Trapcode suite of plugins. This is probably one of my favorite plugins I've ever used in After Effects, and essentially it's just a simple little particle system. You can change your origin point, and particles just emit over time, and you can really adjust a whole lot of things about it. So super quick overview, particles per second, that's fairly straightforward. Lots of particles, not many particles, etc. You know, position in Z space, close to the camera, far away. I'm gonna set this to 1000. And things like velocity, velocity randomness, and how that randomness is distributed, stuff like that. I'm gonna just set this to like 2, randomness to something like, I don't know, 80. I'm kind of just setting these arbitrarily. That's the whole thing about particle systems, is that they can kind of actually be pretty random. In fact, that's going to be part of the point of this tutorial, is instructing you how to make things random enough to be real. So I'm going to start by setting a keyframe, set this to like, say, 1,000 particles per second. I'm going to hit U on the keyboard, and I'm going to go up 1 keyframe and set this to 0. So actually set this to 1,000. Couple more keyframes, I'm gonna set it back to 0. Another thing you might notice is that it's like weird and glitchy. It shouldn't be that way, and that's because you have to reset your seed right here. The reason for that is because it can kind of glitch out using weird cache files internally, yada yada. Basically, if it starts glitching out, just change your seed and things will be great and dandy. So I'm gonna set my velocity up higher, maybe even up the number of particles per second. Stretch that out. Oh, see, there's that glitch I'm talking about. Reset seed, good to go. Poof. All right, so that's a good start. I'm gonna actually set this to directional so that now it actually has a direction that it goes in. So if I set this to, say, somewhere kind of like towards the back and maybe kind of up a little bit. Also, next thing, I'm gonna create a new camera, and that's just to get the focal length to be kind of wide. So the closer you get to the camera, the bigger you get. That's all I'm gonna do with the camera. I'm gonna set this to maybe a little bit closer to the camera, something like this. Move this down here. So we have particles flying up and away from the camera. You notice how they also just kind of like pop out all at once? That's their death. That's the particles dying. But they all die at the same time. We don't want that. Go down to your particles. For now, I'm not really gonna touch anything more of the emitter, but I am gonna start messing with the particle look. And that's basically this. I'm gonna set my feather to 0 first off. Life random, 100. And pretty much I'm gonna go through and I'm gonna set the randomness of all the different options to 100%. Size random, 100. Opacity random, 100. Sweet. Yeah, that's a good start. Next thing to do is to set your size over life. And that brings up this fun little dialog box, which is basically just a graph of size versus time. And it's from birth to death of each individual particle. So for this, it'd be 3 seconds. So here's 0 seconds, and you can draw your little timeline, and then, yeah, 3 seconds. If you set this to 1, it's over the course of 1 second. So I'm gonna go back to 3 seconds. A quick little random seed change, just because it's a good habit to get into. What I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna basically just make it so that it's big at the beginning and tiny at the end, and do the same thing with opacity over life. Just hit this little shortcut button. And that's pretty much all we really need to do. So if we check out how that looks, we're starting to get close. Okay, maybe a little bit more velocity would be nice. All right, so now we've kind of set the look of the particle, but it's still black and white, and we don't want that, obviously. Sparks are not white. They are if they're bright and hot enough, but they're not just uniformly white. So I'm gonna add on this wonderful plugin called VC Color Vibrance from videocopilot.net. Highly recommend it. It's kind of like the tint tool, except it actually takes into account how bright each individual value is. So the brighter it is, the less it tints it. So basically, if it's a really bright particle, it'll be tinted kind of white. If it's a really dark particle, it'll be tinted more, in this case, green. But we're gonna set this to kind of like an orange color. Sweet. And also, sparks aren't little bubbles. We're not blowing bubbles here. We gotta turn on the motion blur. So if we go down to motion blur, set this to on, and immediately things go crazy. Look at that. That's a little too crazy, in fact, because the shutter angle is past 180, which is physically impossible for things captured on camera. So if you set this to 180, it's nice and filmic. Make sure you set your phase to -1/2 your shutter angle. In this case, that's -90 because it's 1/2 of 180. And that just kind of centers where the blur happens. Particle boost, opacity boost, set this up to like, say, something like 20, maybe. I'm gonna drop the size of these particles a little bit, maybe something like 3, maybe up the opacity boost a little bit. Cool, so the point of the VC color vibrance is to just kind of add a little bit of coloration to it as like a baseline. But the real color is gonna come from the glow effect. And I'm just gonna throw on stylized glow. For the sake of all of this, I'm gonna move this even further down so it kind of comes from the corner. Okay, so we got to start there. And so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna add glow. Immediately right off the bat, it starts adding a bit of glow, but we wanna drop our threshold so that it actually grabs more of what the particles are doing. So 0% threshold means everything is gonna glow equally. 100% threshold, which means nothing. 90 something percent means only the brightest things are gonna glow. I'm gonna drop this down to say something like 25-ish, low 20s, and then set our radius to 2. So we have a very tiny radius, and that's just gonna keep it to where the particles are. And intensity, crank that up to something like maybe, I don't know, 4. But more importantly, we gotta change our colors to A and B colors and change the color A to something like maybe an orange and our B to a red. Cool, and I'm gonna change this a little bit more towards red, maybe something around right there. Then I'm gonna duplicate the glow settings. And so we have 2 different sizes of glow here. One is kind of small, just around the particle itself, and then the second one, after I hit Control D to duplicate, we're gonna actually make this a much bigger size glow. I'm gonna up the threshold a bit too, to maybe something in the low 60s, maybe adjust the intensity a bit, but really just kind of adjusting the glow. So we end up with nice bright glow when they're all hot and together, and then they kind of just slowly fade out. All right, that's a decent beginning, I'd say. Okay, so now that we've kind of established what the colors of the particles are gonna be, let's actually start messing with the position of the particles. What actually makes them look like embers is the physics section of particular. I'm just gonna kind of close out of particle right now because we don't really need it. I'm gonna go straight to physics. Here's shading, not gonna touch it. Physics, sweet. Now there's 2 different forms of physics in particular. One is called air model, and that's the one we're gonna use, but the other one's called bounce. And the difference between them is basically if we set it to bounce, the particles can actually interact with, say, some sort of solid you place in your scene, whether that's a floor or a ground plane or something. And you know, it's cool and all, but you don't get any of the air movement and turbulence you get when particles are moving through the air. They interact with the wall and all, that's cool, but we don't get what we really need here for the sparks and embers, which is turbulence. And so we're gonna set this back to air and go down to our air settings and open up the turbulence field. All right, so here is where a lot of the magic for the embers looking realistic is going to happen. First things first, I'm going to change the spin amplitude up to something crazy high. Let's say like 500. And right off the bat, we're starting to get a little bit of movement to it, and that's cool. But you might also notice that nothing really starts going all crazy and chaotic until like towards the end of their particle's life. And that's because the fade in is set to 1 second. So 1 second after this moment is when they're fully activated and it fades in. I'm gonna drop that to something like say 0.5 and obviously change my seed. All right, getting closer. Yeah, I mean, that's cool and all. I'm gonna set the spin frequency up to say something like maybe 2. Yeah, so we're getting a little bit more chaotic motion built in, but still not exactly what we want here. So I'm going to go down to the scale, complexity, and octave settings here. And basically what this does is it controls the noise pattern that we actually see. All right, how to explain the noise on this? So basically what Particular is using is this noise pattern called Perlin noise. And it's essentially the same as what you'd get out of, say, fractal noise or something. Instead of just being white and black noise pattern, it influences where the particles are going to move along. And so what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna drop the scale down to say something like 4 And I'm going to leave the complexity at 3. I think that's all right. So I'm going to briefly explain what the octave multiplier and what the octave scale means. Because for the longest time, I had no idea what any of this meant. I just kind of changed the settings until I got something that looked interesting. Basically, if I set this to 1 on the complexity, it uses 1 layer of noise. And if I set it to 2, it basically adds another layer of noise on top of that. And then 3, another on top of that even. So the octave multiplier essentially means that each new layer of noise that I add on will be affected half as much as the layer before it. So layer 2 will be half as powerful as layer 1, and layer 3 will be half as powerful as layer 2. But I'm going to set this to 2 right now, so now it's twice as powerful the more layers you go up. But I'm going to set the scale to 0.5. So they get more powerful, but also smaller the more layers you add on. Now, you don't want to add too many layers here in the complexity because then it starts looking really unrealistic. So I'm just going to leave this down at 3 instead of 7. All right, getting further along, but still not exactly what we want here. So evolution speed, all of this stuff we're not really going to touch, but we want to affect the position. So I'm going to crank this up to say like 150 and even affect the size a little bit, somewhere between 10 and 20. If you start doing it too much, it starts looking weird. So I'm going to leave this down to between, 15 or so. So if I preview this again real quick, I'm going to set my fade in time to even lower. I'm going to show you what it looks like at 0. This isn't a good example because they're coming from the off screen. So if I was to put it here, this is my origin point, don't forget. They all kind of just start immediately being affected by the position. But if I was to drop this to say, or rather raise it to 0.2, they're actually starting from the point at the beginning, but then they quickly branch out. You can see that here. So if I was to actually increase the time at which particles are being emitted, we'd see it much more clearly, which is cool. If I was to put this back at 0, you can see how it's just crazy right off the bat, which is pretty cool for creating like a shower of sparks if that's your thing. But for the purpose of this, I want a singular point. So I would recommend something at least of 0.2. I'm going to set it at like say 0.3. And again, I'm going to just raise this back up, change my seed. So we kind of get like more of like a hit where sparks fly out for a moment. And that's pretty much it. If I up my spin frequency up to 3, it starts getting a little bit crazier. So basically this is starting to get a little too chaotic, especially if I put the speed frequency way up. Look at that, that is absolutely insane and not what we want. Those are not real embers. So I'm gonna set this back to say 2. All right, so that's pretty much the gist of the physics system within particular for getting some motion in there. You can increase the spin amplitude to something crazy high. You can experiment with like leaving that pretty high, but leaving your spin frequency pretty low. See, now that's starting to get a little ridiculous too, so we don't want to go that direction. So I'm gonna leave this at about 500 and spin frequency of 2. So these are going to be our main particles, and I'm gonna actually increase the velocity a little bit and move them back down here to the corner. Okay, so these particles are starting to look fairly interesting, but I want to add more. So I'm going to actually go down to my aux system rollout here, and that stands for auxiliary system. I'm going to make it so that each particle is actually emitting a different particle. And right now, they're not really doing anything. They just kind of like turn on and eventually fade out of existence. So we want to make them look like our original particles. So we're going to do the same thing as we did before. Going to set randomness to max on pretty much everything. I'm going to actually jump the particles up to, say, 20 particles per second. Crazy. Look at those particles. So if we go down to life, or rather size over life, set that to there. Same thing we did to the other ones. Color over life. Yep, not going to touch that one. Opacity over life, same thing there. And we could set our opacity up to 100, but as you can see, the VC color vibrance is actually affecting the color of them depending on their opacity. So if I set it to full brightness, they're all kind of like a uniform color. Meh. If I set it to 0, they're obviously not there. But if I add it up a little bit to say something like, say, 50, you start really getting some cool color variation in there. So the next thing we want to do is actually go down to our physics, or rather, no, first, control from main particles. Inherent velocity, I'm going to set that to like, I don't know, let's set that to say 50% speed. So now they're inherent, whoa, that's crazy looking. Weird, okay, yeah, sure. But I want to have these particles stop emitting maybe about 25% into the life of the original ones. So that way we don't get carried away with the number of particles being rolled out. And also for the physics, I'm going to basically add a little tiny bit of air resistance, 1. If I was to set this to a bunch, the particles roll out and immediately stop moving. If I set it to 4, they move a little bit, but really slow down. So I'm just gonna set this to 1. And randomness. Life randomness, 100. Opacity randomness, 100. Size randomness, I'm gonna set that to 50. And turbulence position, I'm gonna crank that up to like, say, in the mid 200s somewhere, and go back up to my seed and reset it. So let's see what that looks like. I'm gonna drop my size on this a little bit, something like, say, maybe 2. They're starting to overpower the original sparks, and I'm still getting that weird motion there at the beginning. Like they move out really quickly and then go into their turbulence, like right here. You see that change? And I think that's because I have the fade-ins. There's 2 different fade-ins. There's one for the spin and there's one for the turbulence field. And so I'm gonna set the turbulence field to 0 so that it's always in it. And I'm gonna up the spin fade-in to, say, 0.5. And if I reset my seed, let's see what that looks like. It's a little bit more natural anyway. Again, this is not a perfect particle system. We're using a noise map rather than actually simulating anything, but we can get pretty close, so this isn't that bad. All right, so I mean, this is basically, an Embers system that you've now set up, and you can do various things to it. So I'm gonna start doing that. So instead of having it pop on and then pop off, I'm gonna actually just keep it going for a while. I'm gonna set this to 1000, and then I'm gonna go one more frame and set it back to 0. So now we have an on and then an off. I'm going to move this so that it stays on for a while. So now if I was to preview this, it's like a sparkler going off, just constantly emitting a bunch of new sparks, which is maybe what you're going for. I dig it. This might be something you're looking for if you want to do like an angle grinder or something, just grinding away at a piece of metal and you have sparks flying off. You'd probably want to reduce the number of sparks you have because that's kind of intense. But it's looking pretty sweet. They kind of look real to me, considering, again, it's a noise pattern, not a simulation. But let's see, if I was to, say, reset my rotation on the direction, I want it to go up. What if we made it, like, point straight up? I just realized what that does. So the turbulence position offset on the auxiliary system will actually move all the particles away, which I don't really want. So I'm actually gonna leave that at, like, 20, so it's kind of off, but not far off. Learning something even when I'm making tutorials. All right, moving on. If I was to change the position to be somewhere down off the bottom here, I haven't actually tried this before, so we'll see how it looks. I'm going to set the position keyframe, hit U to bring up all my keyframes. I'm gonna set this to the beginning here. I'm gonna go to the end where I'm going to move the position so that it's way off to the side. Something like this. And reset our seed. Is that even doing anything? I don't know, man. I'll set this to 2000. Okay, well, let's preview this and see what it looks like. Well, that's kind of cool. Whoa, look at all those sparks. So I've never actually made it look like this before. So that's what makes this so powerful, right? Is that now that you've actually set up your system, you've set up your turbulence to kind of make realistic motion, now you can do whatever you want with these things. You can have it go really fast. Whoa. Okay, that's pretty crazy. All right, here's another little thing. I just kind of decreased the amount of time it takes for it to transition over. Okay, at this point, I'm not really doing a tutorial anymore. I'm kind of just like messing with making different types of embers. So because of that, I'm actually going to save all of these effects as a preset. And to do that for future reference, if you select all of them by hitting Control A, now I've selected all of my effects here. If you go up to animation, you can save your animation preset. I'm just gonna call this Fire Embers. Yay. So now that I've saved that as a preset, I can actually apply all of these effects to a new layer. So if I make a new layer, say whatever, in whatever project file on whatever day, you just type in Fire Embers and apply it. And it's all the same effects, even with the keyframes you have. So if I have this, goes out and then another wave comes out, oh man. Obviously I could have gotten the same thing by just duplicating the layer, but what if you're in a new project and you don't have this layer available anymore? save your animation preset. And on top of that, I'm actually gonna give you these presets. So I'm gonna make a couple, various ones like this one I'll give you. So download those, they're in the description. All right, so that's cool and all, but if you follow me on Instagram, @RenTheReaper, I highly recommend it, you may have seen that I did this little video. Pretty much the same process, I've changed a couple things, particularly like having the thing fly across the screen. So let's try to make that real quick. If you wanna see more of this stuff, follow me on Instagram, just saying. All right, so back to this. What does that really entail? Okay, so first off, our position, if I move this to say there, move this up to the side, and then move it way over to the other side, maybe like right there. So as it spawns, it flies across. Okay, but because we also still had all this directional stuff turned on, I'm gonna turn that off. I'm just gonna set it to uniform and maybe stretch that out a little bit, and of course change the seed. I'm gonna push this back in Z space a little bit more. Here's the thing, they're all orange, and if you were to see in the video, half of them are bluish, although the Instagram filter kind of compresses most of that out. But if you wanted to say, have this be a different color, I'm gonna just go ahead and duplicate this and turn off our first layer there. What you can do is you can just change the colors. Let's say we want this to be blue. Change that to be blue, and then change these colors to be maybe like a light, and then like a really intense blue. Whoa, so intense. And these ones, see how we have a little bit of that orange glow in there? Gotta change that up too. Set that to be a light blue, and pick the same color for that one. So now we have this really, really cool, vibrant blue color. If I was to turn on the original one, it doesn't look different because they're on the same seed. So I'm gonna go up to the blue one and just change the seed so it'll immediately look different. And voila. Shoo. Multicolored sparks. So if I was to do that differently, I can just duplicate this layer right here, and then if I just isolate it, I can throw on a hue and saturation filter and literally just change the hue. I found the results to be not quite as good doing it this way, but in a pinch, it works great. So I'm gonna go up and change the seed real quick so that it looks different from my original particle system, and then watch both of them. That is definitely something. It's a little weird. It's a little weird. I mean, maybe that's what you want. I don't know. Who am I to judge? But for one, that's way too many sparks. I would probably decrease the number of sparks on both of those layers, and also maybe adjust the color a bit. I'm not quite a fan of how there we go, something a little bit more blue. This is the fun part. This is where you get to adjust stuff. So if I set this to add, you can actually get some additive color in there. Well, that pretty much ends it for this tutorial. So if you think you learned something in this video, please share it. I know I had trouble finding Sparks tutorials, so I ended up just making one, you know. So yeah, if you want to see more of these, let me know. It's been 2 years since the last time I made an epic tutorial, so I was pretty happy to make a new one. If you want to get in contact with me, you can leave a comment. You can hit me up on Twitter or Instagram. I follow those pretty regularly. And I'll see you guys later. Oh boy. Woo! I wonder how that was.